The war in Ukraine has been going on for more than 4 full years now, and everyone is trying to find the finish line. In a normal war, one side wins, one side loses, and then somehow life tries to move back toward normal. That's the version of this war's ending that most people have in their heads. But this is not a normal war, and its ending could spell doom for Russia and possibly even for Ukraine. So let's dive right into it. Rather than ending with a clean victor and a loser, the most likely outcome of the war in Ukraine is a frozen front, at least according to the French Institute for International Strategic Affairs' IRIS 2025 analysis, one that's supported by the lack of progress in the first half of 2026. Now, imagine the conflict between North and South Korea, just on a slightly bigger scale, and this time in the middle of Europe. The two sides would draw the new de facto borders carved from what Russia could occupy of Ukraine. The lines of contact would stagnate, as neither side could commit to a full peace treaty. The reason for that is simple. Russia never achieved what it set out to do at the onset of the invasion. On the other side, Ukraine is unlikely to fully cede the territory Russia occupied, especially given that it did once before in 2014. The war will likely end, so to speak, with a short or long-term ceasefire, depending on the geopolitical climate at the moment, when both sides exhaust their resources. But on Russia's side, the problems that were introduced before and during the war won't just disappear overnight. Instead, Russia has changed its economy, its governance, the social hierarchy, and even the Russian culture, as it's seen both internally and abroad. And it has all made Russia weaker. But let's start with what peace actually means, because Russia and Ukraine are not waiting for the same thing. In Ukraine, the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, founded in January 2026, reported in a survey conducted on February 12 to 24, 2026, that 57% of Ukrainians categorically reject the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donbass, even in exchange for security guarantees from the United States and Europe. The message from Ukraine is clear. They can accept a frozen front only if a real security architecture comes with it, including binding guarantees, NATO alignment, and a path to membership. What they will not accept is a concession dressed up as a compromise, especially one that leaves the country exposed the next time Moscow decides the moment is right. That was already tried and didn't work in 2014 with Crimea. Russia is a different story. In December 2025, the state pollster, Vitsum, and the independent Levada Center arrived at the same headline from two different directions. Vitsum, in its year-end presentation, found that 55% of Russians linked their hopes for a better 2026 directly to the war ending, with 70% viewing the coming year as more successful than the last. Levada, which operates under a foreign agent designation and surveyed 1,618 respondents across 50 Russian regions in mid-December, found that 66% of Russians actually favor a shift to peace talks. By February 2026, Levada's pro-negotiation figure had climbed further to 67.2%, with those in favor of continued operations down to 24.3%. But there is a contradiction buried inside those numbers that matters enormously. The same Levada data shows that 3/4 of Russians believe Russia should make no territorial concessions to end the war. They want the shooting to stop, and they want to believe they did not lose, both of those things at once. That combination is precisely why any ceasefire is such an unstable political outcome inside Russia. It gives the Kremlin something it can package as success. The state will say that it held the line, defended national interests, and stood up to NATO. But there's likely going to be another question here. Why does everything seem so much worse for Russia? Well, that question leads directly to the second problem. The same ceasefire will produce two completely different verdicts, and only one of them is survivable for the country that receives it. Are we already in World War III? Because depending on what you read, it can feel like we're living in completely different realities. And keeping up with the news isn't the hard part anymore, it's figuring out what's actually true. Take this story covered by nearly 200 sources across the spectrum. It reports the US military says its blockade of Iranian ports has completely halted economic trade within 36 hours. But just one day earlier, another story, mostly covered by nearly 80 sources, most being left-leaning, said marine traffic in the Strait of Hormuz was barely affected on the first day of the blockade. So, which is it? Total shutdown, barely a disruption, or can both be true? That divide in coverage is exactly why we use ground news to help keep us informed on the multiple active conflicts happening around the world. If you only saw one of those headlines, you'd walk away with just one perspective and a completely different understanding of what's going on. Ground news pulls in thousands of news stories every day and organizes them by topic, showing you bias, reliability, and ownership for every source so you can see every angle in one place. One feature we've been using a lot lately is Blind Spot. It shows you stories heavily covered by one side of the political spectrum, but barely talked about by the other. No matter where you fall politically, breaking out of the echo chamber gives you a more accurate understanding of what's really happening, and that's incredibly important when it comes to breaking through the fog of war. So go to ground.news/military show or scan the QR code for 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan. And it brings the price down for less than the price of a cup of coffee. So give Ground News a shot for yourself. For Ukraine, the national story is already rewritten, and it will hold regardless of where the front line freezes. Before February 2022, Western analysts still discussed Ukraine through the lens of Russia. As a post-Soviet and corrupt nation, trapped in Moscow's orbit, the little brother who could be leaned on, bought, frightened, or partitioned if necessary. That viewpoint is all but gone in 2026. Even without the immediate return of every occupied territory, Ukraine can say something historically significant. A much larger state launched a full-scale invasion, committed to its destruction, deployed its largest army since World War II against it, and failed to force it back into subordination. It's the raison d'etre for Ukraine's stance on NATO and EU integration. For Russia, the same ceasefire is all about exposure and political posturing. The Kremlin sold this war as a short, righteous demonstration of greatness as the Russian Empire is trying to reform to its fullest. The invasion was called a special military operation that would be over in days, that would prove Ukraine was not a real state, and that would force the West to treat Russia as a serious power again. Instead, 4 years later, Russia is poorer, more isolated, dependent on China, and hated across both Eastern Europe, the same states that used to be a part of the Warsaw Pact, and unable to make a credible case that anything it built during this war was worth what it cost. Remember, Russia has the larger army, the larger population, the Soviet stockpile, the energy revenues, the nuclear arsenal, and the propaganda machine. Yet it still couldn't force Ukraine to yield, and the war turned into a colossal failure and a monetary and morale drain on the country. Economics-wise, the defense minister Andrei Belousov confirmed in December 2025 that Russia spent 7.3% of GDP on defense in 2025. Applied to the government's own GDP estimate for that year, that implies total military expenditure of roughly $198 billion. That's money that didn't go into infrastructure, healthcare, or economic modernization. Russia's GDP contracted between 0.2% and 0.5% year-on-year in the first quarter of 2026, which was its first quarterly decline since early 2023, and it arrived as a shock even to Russia's own institutions, which had forecast a 1.6% growth for that period. Shortly after, the Russian government slashed its full-year 2026 GDP growth forecast from 1.3% to just 0.4%. Inflation is running at approximately 6% and continues to erode household purchasing power. Russia's central bank kept its key interest rate at multi-decade highs for an extended period to fight that inflation, which reduced civilian investment and borrowing even as defense factories ran at full capacity. Energy revenues, Russia's primary fiscal lifeline, fell approximately 40% year-on-year in the 12 months through April 2026, driven by lower crude prices, European sanctions, and a strong ruble that squeezed export margins. In turn, Russia is implementing a VAT increase that took effect in January 2026, which effectively leeches money from medium-sized businesses to try to continue to fund the war. And for a period, the war gave Russia an artificial economic boost. Defense factories pulled in workers, wages rose in some sectors, state television could point to production figures and call it a strength. But beneath the surface, credit became expensive, independent speech became dangerous, travel became harder, prices kept rising, and even people who still supported Putin increasingly complained, when they felt safe enough to say so, that officials were lying, suppressing bad news, and hiding reality from the top. The clearest public signal of that came when Victoria Bonia, a Russian television personality best known for reality shows and beauty content, posted a video rant about the state of Russian life that drew more than 30 million views and forced the Kremlin to respond publicly. And it wasn't because she said anything especially sophisticated, but because she was exactly the kind of person who was not supposed to say it. The Kremlin can dismiss liberals, exiles, and dissidents as Western agents. But when someone from the apolitical world of celebrity and luxury says the system is rotting, millions of ordinary Russians can recognize the mood and sympathize. That moment could have been a signal about where public sentiment actually sits, something that Putin certainly didn't want. And as for the public itself, the actual winners of the war in Ukraine aren't going to be the governments of the countries at war, but the people who took part in it. For Russia specifically, the first and most visible group here is contract soldiers and their families. In poor regions, military service became a great elevator for social and economic climbing, with wages that would rival some of the most lucrative jobs in the country. In July 2024, 2 years into the war, Putin signed a decree nearly doubling the federal signing bonus for recruits and recommended that regional authorities match it from their own budgets. In early 2026, the regional signing bonus reached 2.6 million rubles, or approximately $35,000 in total in some regions. For men with fewer other options, this was wealth they'd never seen and had no other path to. The monthly salary for a contract soldier fighting in Ukraine stood at 210,000 rubles, about $2,400 back in 2025, more than double the national average wage. This pulled labour away from civilian jobs, drove wage inflation across affected regions, and created a population of families whose standard of living was entirely dependent on the war continuing. Now, before we get into that, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We post analyses like these and recaps of daily events in global geopolitics so you can be up to date. The second group is the defence industry workforce. Arms plants, drone manufacturers, electronic suppliers, and repair facilities were the ones who needed the most manpower, and the government could supply a steady stream of contracts to fulfill them. But these sectors face two major issues. One, the Russian government is notorious for underpaying for contracts or simply failing to pay them due to being one of the few available options for manufacturers to get said contracts. Consequently, even when these manufacturers should be thriving, the Kremlin is so strapped for cash, ironically due to funding soaring military wages, that it defaults on payments for the very hardware required to sustain the war effort. Second, these sectors can't really return to normal when military orders stop. Once contracts dry up, suppliers will lose customers, and the workers who had stable employment in a booming sector will suddenly find themselves in a stagnating civilian economy. There is no planned transition, no managed conversion, no civilian production pipeline waiting to absorb them. Russia is running on a war economy without a post-war destination for it. The third group is smaller but politically louder, the ideological class. Z-bloggers, patriotic influencers, volunteer fundraisers, local fixers who learned to speak the language of war and discovered, often for the first time in their lives, that they were important. Before 2022, many of them were nobodies. The war handed them audiences, revenue, access to power, and a sense of purpose that most of them had never had. But their relevance is entirely contingent on the conflict remaining the central fact of Russian public life. When it stops, so does their channel for fame. And people who lose status and purpose after experiencing both for the first time tend not to go quietly. Now, on the other end of the war, Ukraine's war economy produced a different kind of winner, one that's convertible to peacetime. Drone engineers, cybersecurity specialists, logistic coordinators, rehabilitation workers. Ukraine is securing contracts from various Western countries to share in its development and knowledge. All those people and all that infrastructure that Ukraine has built can be leveraged to improve NATO as a whole or simply sold to the highest bidder. The defense technology that Ukraine built has been battle-tested and proven to work. Meanwhile, Russian equipment has repeatedly exposed its structural inadequacies on the modern battlefield. Furthermore, Ukraine has built up supplementary sectors: defense technology, precision manufacturing, logistics infrastructure, and energy repair. And these have far more long-term prospects for continued research. Russia's war sectors are almost entirely the opposite, since they produce weapons, and when the demand for weapons falls, they produce unemployment. But the group that matters most for long-term political stability is not the influencers or the factory workers, it's the veterans. And what a state does with its veterans tells you what kind of state it is, and what kind of future it's building toward. In Ukraine, the scale alone is staggering. The German Marshall Fund reports that Ukraine already faced the challenge of supporting over 1.2 million veterans in early 2025, with projections indicating that number will rise to between 5 and 6 million once active duty personnel rotate out. That's roughly 1 in every 6 Ukrainians. The Peace Research Institute Oslo estimates that up to 5 million veterans and their families will require reintegration support once the war ends, well over 15% of the country's total population. There is no historical precedent for a reintegration challenge of that size in a country simultaneously trying to rebuild from $195 billion in direct infrastructure damage. But Ukraine is something Russia doesn't: a coherent national story that gives the veterans' sacrifice meaning. The men and women who served defended their homeland. They kept Ukraine alive as a sovereign state when a larger power tried to erase it. Veterans in Ukraine can become local politicians, party organizers, business owners, demining experts, reconstruction managers, border security specialists, and civic activists. Russia faces a structurally different problem, and it begins with the state's attitude. The Kremlin doesn't want veterans as citizens with agency. It wants them as decorations, while they are useful, like heroes to show off at patriotic events and state media. The model is to ship them back to their homes, track what they're doing, deploy them on theatrical appearances, and then hopefully forget about them. That's not just conjecture. Some estimates suggest that over half of veterans who return from Ukraine can't find a stable job. They're simply too shell-shocked by the war or literally injured, and yet are not receiving any kind of consistent support. The reason for this containment becomes obvious once you think about it. A Russian government that genuinely empowered veterans as citizens with their own networks, their own grievances, and their own moral authority would be creating a political force it can't control. And the Kremlin's entire political model, or more precisely Putin's, depends on controlling every significant force in Russian public life. But this comes with its own risks. These are men trained in violence, paid more than they had ever earned in their civilian lives, told at every turn that they were heroes and the backbone of the nation, and now returning to a stagnating economy that cannot pay what the front paid, in a system with no credible path for them to become anything other than former soldiers. There is no Russian equivalent of the GI Bill, no functioning rule of law that reliably protects small businesses, no credible retraining system not compromised by ideology, no political culture in which veterans are expected to participate as citizens with independent voices. When the state tries to manage that situation through surveillance and selective patronage rather than genuine inclusion, it's not solving the problem, it's deferring it. And deferred problems among armed, organized, disillusioned men with unit networks, command habits, and contempt for civilian institutions have a way of surfacing violently. The statistics are harrowing, as over 500 civilians have been killed or injured by veterans after they return from the front line. So then, extrapolate that to the possible millions of veterans returned to economic collapse, feeling betrayed by the institutions they had fought for, and found that the existing system had no real place for them or their anger. It's a kettle just waiting to boil over. So it's clear that Russia has a long road ahead and is quite weaker than it started. And that could be a problem for not just Russians, but potentially everyone in Europe and beyond. Back to Russia. The main issue here is that Russia, or Putin, might feel like there's nothing else to lose at this point. Let's go with the geography, because it's the foundation of everything. Russia launched this war partly to restore the buffer zone that Russian military doctrine considers essential to national survival. Ukraine was previously used as a buffer zone that the Soviet Union had between itself and a potential German offensive. This manifested in World War II, for instance. So, generations of Russian military planners considered territorial buffers between the Russian heartland and hostile powers to the west as a necessity of life. And those buffers needed to be firmly subservient to Mother Russia, like Ukraine did before independence. And then the Soviet Union broke up, and Ukraine started making pro-Western moves with each passing year. The war was meant to reverse that, but it arguably made it worse in almost every measurable way. Finland's joining NATO in 2023 nearly doubled the length of Russia's land border with the alliance. Sweden's accession extended NATO's presence across the Baltic Sea. Ukraine, which Putin argued in a 2021 article was not a real country and was being turned into a weapon against Russia, has now actually become exactly that, alongside hosting a million-strong combat-experienced military, its own domestic missile program with a reported range of up to 600 miles and one of the world's most advanced drone industries. The war in Ukraine was basically a self-fulfilling prophecy, turning Ukraine into the enemy Putin thought it already was. Then there's the technology dimension, which compounds the geography problem and makes it effectively unsolvable. Even if Russia could somehow restore a territorial buffer to its west, this wouldn't solve the threat. European countries are now actively acquiring deep precision strike capabilities driven by Russia's own violation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the United States' withdrawal from it in response. Russia's 2024 nuclear doctrine also becomes significant in this context. The new verbiage arguably lowers the threshold for nuclear escalation to include receiving what it calls reliable data of incoming conventional weapons strikes against Russia or Belarus. This led NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte to warn the alliance's members in December 2025 to prepare for a potential war with Russia within 5 years. Of course, it wouldn't be the first time Russia has pulled the "we will nuke you" card. It's done that dozens of times over the course of the war, every time the West thought about deepening its support for Ukraine. But a Russia that emerges from this war with depleted conventional forces, a stagnating economy, and a growing sense of encirclement might just have an incentive to actually lean on its nuclear arsenal as its primary instrument of deterrence and coercion. Russia has grown structurally, economically, and even geopolitically dependent on Beijing since 2022, with Chinese technology becoming a critical enabler of the Russian defense industry and Chinese trade filling the gap left by collapsing European economic ties. Russia signed a major new gas pipeline deal with China in September 2025, the Power of Siberia 2, deepening an energy relationship that's essentially allowing Russia to continue to fund the war. But Russia is, in practice, the junior partner in that relationship, dependent on Chinese technology, Chinese markets, and Chinese diplomatic cover in ways that directly contradict its self-image as a great independent power. That dependency will deepen after the war because Russia will have even fewer alternatives when the dust settles. So, what does all of this add up to? What the war has actually produced is the deepest, most irreversible separation in the modern history of both peoples. Ukraine will emerge from this conflict wounded, exhausted, and grieving on a scale that's difficult to overstate. But it will also carry a renewed identity and international backing from Western institutions that have already committed hundreds of billions of dollars to its recovery, alongside a more than healthy defense technology sector that's internationally recognized and on par with that of the US and NATO itself. But Russia will emerge from the same conflict as a shell of a country. It will have a veteran class with no credible political outlet and every reason for resentment. The economy that was built for war and not for peace will struggle to find new ways to use and abuse its citizens for taxation. And the current leadership might even be considered good compared to what we might get if things turn so dire that Putin decides that he doesn't actually want peace at all. And to learn more about who might succeed Putin if it comes to that, make sure to check out this video and stay subscribed to The Military Show for more exciting news.